Joseph Lindsley is in Kharkiv. Let's find out what's happening in Ukraine today. Joe, as you know, President Biden says that the war in Ukraine has to end before NATO can consider Kyiv's membership of the alliance. What is your take on that, and what are people saying there?
Yeah, well, Bob, good afternoon from Kharkiv. And yeah, President Biden just moments ago, or actually right now, he's meeting with King Charles in the UK on his way to the NATO summit, which starts tomorrow in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. And, you know, there's, I would say, the questions of, the big headlines the past few days about Ukraine have been about, NATO membership and also about these cluster munitions. The United States and the Biden administration said that they will send the controversial cluster munitions to Ukraine. And I think that these two topics, whether or not NATO will accept Ukraine as a member one day, and the cluster munitions, are perhaps a distraction from the real question. I think that's what people here in Ukraine feel. The question that on everyone's mind here: will the West supply Ukraine in order to retake Crimea and to eliminate the threat of Russian missiles? Can the West and can NATO leaders, as they meet the next 2 days in Lithuania, can they agree on a definition for what victory is? And 15 years ago, at another NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania, the leaders of NATO nations promised that one day Georgia, the nation of Georgia across the Black Sea, which also borders Russia, and Ukraine would one day be welcomed into the NATO alliance. That was in 2008. And back then, Ukraine was a very different place. I mean, Ukraine, there was tons of corruption. It was still in this Soviet-minded mentality. You still had the secret police. And all of that has changed since 2014, since the Revolution of Dignity. And I think a lot of these, including even President Biden, it seems that they haven't updated their information about Ukraine from 2008, even though President Biden, has visited Ukraine many times. But in an interview before he left the United States, Biden told CNN's Fareed Zakaria that that Ukraine still needs to, quote, democratize in order to join NATO. And I think this is, if you look at Ukrainians are willing to die for democracy, but actually, if you compare Ukrainian democracy, I think, to many Western countries, you'd see that Ukraine is not necessarily worse off and maybe stronger. I mean, look at the riots in Paris. I travel around America, too. I mean, the poverty I've seen in some American cities, the homelessness I've seen in San Francisco, you do not see that in Ukrainian society. And there's this healthiness here, which was not like that in 2008. But since 2014, since the people kicked out that pro-Russian regime, Ukraine has been developing, in some ways, kind of unnoticed those 8 years up until Russia's full-scale invasion. And again, like here I am in the city of Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia, and the biggest threat, is missiles coming from the sky. But at night, when there's no streetlights, there's only a few hours of darkness because we're further north. But you don't feel any sense of fear. There's a sense of social cohesion, and this is such a pleasant country. And so when Ukrainians hear, even now, President Biden and others lecturing them on democracy, I think that hurts a lot. And then the other major headlines were about these cluster munitions. And if you read the stories about the cluster munitions, no story mentions in the beginning, in the headlines or in the first paragraph, the fact that Russia has used these cluster munitions against Ukraine for almost 17 months. And so the sense is, as you read the stories, and Russian propaganda is using this very adeptly, that Ukraine is using weapons that should be banned, and Ukraine is the inhumane one. And so as we go into this very important summit, there's this negativity toward Ukraine. And so that is really quite concerning. And it's also, it's important to note that the cluster munitions, so these are rockets. When they fire, they sort of deploy a bunch of mini bombs that explode. And the concern about them is that some of those bombs do not explode until much later. So they can pose, basically, there'll be de facto landmines, and they can pose problems for many years to come. But we have to note that the American-made cluster munitions are much higher quality than the Russian-made munitions that Russia has been using even in this very city from which I'm speaking to you. In fact, today, as I was running through the park, I could see pockmarks in the trail in the park on the pavement from Russia's cluster munitions. But the American munitions are much more effective, and they explode more. They have a 1% dud rate compared to like a 40% dud rate for the Russian munitions. So we're talking about two different things, and it's also because Ukraine really does need more ammunition because they've had to use so much to get to this point where we are today.
Well, you should know that yesterday, Chicago's Ukrainian community marked 500 days since the invasion with a protest on Michigan Avenue. And, of course, they condemned the war crimes. So we're thinking about you, and I'm stuck on you being 30 miles from Russia. That's like downtown to Libertyville here. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah,
you got to really be
about it too much. It's
you got to really be alert.
It's scary. Yeah, and we've had many error alarms, for example, today. But because we are so close, the Russians get hit at any moment. And another question going into this NATO summit: is Russia going to be silent during these next few days so they can sort of play the victim, or are they going to pound Ukraine, hoping they can scare the West? And so this is sort of the anxiety on everyone's minds here as we look into what's going to happen the next few days. But again, this question of whether or not Ukraine can join NATO, that's not even a serious possibility. And the real question is, can Ukraine, can we all agree on a definition of victory? And meanwhile, also in the UK, you have the Wimbledon tournament, and Ukrainian tennis player Alina Svitolina, she advanced to the quarterfinals, and she beat a Belarusian player. And she refused to shake the Belarusian's hand because Belarus, is Russia's ally, and many of the missiles and have come from Belarus during this war. And the crowd at Wimbledon booed the Belarusian player, and the Belarusian player's response to that, I think, really shows us the difference between Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians, the difference between free people and those who live in tyranny. The Belarusian player, she complained. She said, "It's a tennis match. Nobody's changing lives here. We are just playing tennis. We are just doing our jobs. That's it." But for the Ukrainians, that's not it. If you have a platform, if you have a chance to speak out against tyranny, which Ukrainians have done in their own country, cleaning up the pro-Russian tyranny and even the Ukrainian oligarchs, since 2014, Ukrainians say, we are human beings and we have agency and we can always resist. And that mentality of the Belarusian player is actually, it's a very Soviet mentality. Just shut up and do your job. And Ukrainians refuse to shut up. And that's a big difference.
And boy, you can understand why they have to speak out. Joseph, be careful. We'll talk tomorrow.
Thank you, Bob. Until tomorrow.
Thank you for introducing Ukraine on your social media pages. That's very important that much more people can get more information about the situation here and how everybody can help Ukraine to stay stronger and to save all the world.
Что он сказал?
Well, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Come on now. Oh, which side are you on?
На чьей ты стороне?
Ебать.